All right, now we're going to be talking about Chapter 3, Video 2. So again, make sure that you have your materials available so that you will be prepared. And again, we're still talking in Chapter 3 about life in the colonies and what it looked like and how people behaved and how it was developing. Cities certainly were developing in that time period. We left off talking about the Middle Atlantic having the most diversity in the cities. And we're going to see cities there growing at a faster rate than we see in other places. Now, the cities back then were pretty dangerous. You have to keep in mind these are all dirt roads. There's no light whatsoever, so no street lights. And of course, when you have wagons going along the streets or horses going along the streets, there's no headlights or anything like that. You might carry a lantern, but it doesn't throw off a considerable amount of light. So it was pretty dangerous. And the sanitation was terrible. People living along a lot of the city streets, if they didn't have an outhouse or if they chose not to use their outhouse and they used a chamber pot, they then would just dump the contents of that chamber pot out into the street. And it would be dispersed as horses came along and wagons and so forth. Stagecoaches will start to be used in 1732, meaning stagecoaches that you could hire to transport you from one place to another. And people will start using them more and more. And that's where taverns then are going to become important places for people to exchange information. You would stop at a tavern, have something to eat. You might stay the night, and then you would talk with the other people at that restaurant, at the tavern, about what was going on in your colony, in your area. And it was a good way to exchange information. That will lead ultimately, well, we had a postal system for a long time. The postal system will develop more and more, particularly as the roads develop, the postal system will get better. The first postal system had been developed in Massachusetts in 1677, and then Pennsylvania will follow. And I bring up Pennsylvania because Ben Franklin is going to be the deputy postmaster in the colonies out of Pennsylvania, but he'll do it throughout the colonies, and he will bring better routes and better rates and so forth and really help streamline our early postal system. With that early postal system, we'll see more newspapers because they will be carried from place to place by the postal delivery people. By 1745, we see about 22 papers across the colonies that are developing, and that's going to lead to an early court case called the John Peter Zenger case. Zenger was accused of seditious libel because he had criticized the governor of New York. In England, you were not allowed to criticize elected officials. The crime was called sedition. So when John Peter Zenger wrote an article talking about the governor of New York doing some bad things, he was accused of seditious libel, that he was lying and talking bad about the government leaders. In the court case here in the colonies, however, Zenger is going to prove that what he had written was accurate about the governor of New York, and a colonial jury will find him not guilty. And what we see here is where there are greater rights for freedom of the press over here in the colonies than what you would find in England, because even proving that it was true in an English court wouldn't get you out of trouble for the sedition. You couldn't even say truthful bad things about the political leaders, the government leaders in England. So we'll see that John Peter Zenger case as an important step to free press here in the colonies. And we need to talk about the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment was something that had begun in England, and it's a bit of a scientific revolution that leads to some other types of revolutions. This is where you have Copernicus coming up with the heliocentric theory that the sun is the center of the universe, not us. You have Newton's theory of gravitation coming through and so forth. And there's the increasing understanding that the universe is ruled by certain natural laws. And this will lead to John Locke's ideas about there being natural rights as well. So you see where the scientific revolution becomes a political and philosophical revolution as well. But there's a greater focus on reason, and science and observation, which seemed to be a lesser focus on religion, and that will come into play. Now, the epitome of an enlightened thinker here in the colonies is Ben Franklin. He published the Pennsylvania Gazette, Poor Richard's Almanac. He started a library. He set up a fire company. He began the University of Pennsylvania, which was our first college in the colonies that wasn't connected with religion. He invented the Franklin stove, lightning rod, a glass harmonica, all sorts of things. Just a very diverse person as well with his interests. So he's sort of the epitome of the Enlightenment and this new way of looking at things, and that's going to make some religious leaders very nervous because in their mind it was pulling people away from religion and away from a focus on God. And so we see a great awakening develop. And this was a wave of evangelism that swept through the colonies where ministers were trying to make sure that the colonists stayed with the religious beliefs and didn't completely abandon religion in favor of reason and science and so forth. One of the first famous preachers of the Great Awakening was George Whitefield. And he is going to preach that the Puritan ministers had become, quote, slothful shepherds and dumb dogs. Very critical of the Puritan ministers. And he is going to focus more on each person's individual salvation and the need for each person to have a new birth. And he thought that the Puritan ministers had become too comfortable with their power and were not focused on the things that they needed to focus on with the parishioners. Now, Whitefield is going to preach about this, and another minister named Jonathan Edwards is going to pick up this idea. And Jonathan Edwards is going to think that people have become a little too materialistic, and he worries that religion had become a little too intellectual and that people were leaving their faith and the passion and the emotion that can come through faith. He wrote a sermon called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And the idea behind this is somewhat captured in a quote that God looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast into the fire. It is the idea that all that is saving us, that God is holding us in his hand, and all that is saving us is God's mercy. Otherwise, he would just flick us into the fire to burn for all eternity. And he is trying to scare people back to religion, back to leading life the way he believed that people should be leading their lives. This Great Awakening is going to start a lot of new religious movements and religious groups throughout the colonies, and it's going to weaken the impact of the Puritan ministers because there was such criticism of those ministers and a greater focus on people's individual beliefs and individual salvation, not on simply what the Puritan ministers told them to believe.